But I do know that psychedelics can be helpful for people of color dealing with racism. And we have research that shows that it can, and that many people of color are using psychedelics to heal from racial trauma. We did a study a few years ago where we did a national survey in the United States and in Canada, to ask people of color if they were using psychedelics to help with their racial trauma. And we were worried at first, like, well, what if we don't get anybody? And what if nobody's doing that? Or they are and nobody wants to talk about it. And we were so surprised at the response that we got.
Hello, Dr. Williams. How are you doing?
Hello, it's good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. And I'm really excited to talk to you and ask you a lot of questions. So here we go. Before we get started, I just want to bring up that this podcast is brought to you by MAPS Canada. As MAPS Canada moves forward in becoming the leading Canadian source of information, resources, and advocacy in psychedelic medicine, we recognize the evolving nature of scientific knowledge. This podcast is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute medical, legal, or professional advice. I would also like to acknowledge that I am recording this podcast from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, which is now called Vancouver. And here is something about Dr. Monnica Williams. Dr. Monnica T. Williams, a board certified clinical psychologist and Canada Research Chair based at the University of Ottawa, specializes in BIPOC mental health and psychedelic therapy. She directs the Behavioral Wellness Clinic and has published over 200 scientific articles and researches racial trauma and culturally competent care. Her work is widely recognized in major psychological organizations and coverage in top media outlets. Thank you again and welcome to the Maps Canada podcast, Dr. Williams.
Oh, thank you for
Um,
having me.
yeah, as before I was speaking about, like before the interview, I was telling you, like you are somebody who is like really inspiring to me because when I see a person of color at a position of power, which you hold, I mean, over 200 scientific papers, and I've been following your work from the last 8 years, you inspire me so much. And I can definitely say that one of the reasons I'm becoming a clinical psychologist is because I see the change that you're bringing in, and it's really impactful. So, yeah, thank you.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear because we absolutely need more clinicians of color. We need more people doing this work, especially in clinical psychology. So,
Yeah.
hats off to
Um,
you.
Thank you. Um, because we're talking about this, I just wanted to get into it and ask you, when Rick Doblin was speaking about the Lycos and the Maps USA, the FDA approval, and it didn't go through because the second study had issues about like less diversity, and then they realized and they brought in more people of color, but they were realizing that of color weren't coming in because there were no people of color therapists. Um, and because we're talking about maps, and I know you have spoken out about it, I just want to ask you, how has your experience been about diversity and Maps Canada or USA?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question because MAPS originally reached out to me when I was still living in the States. I was a professor at the University of Louisville, and I had just actually done a media thing on racial trauma for the New York Times. And I think they had seen that and they realized that some of their studies, they didn't have any, like there were no Black participants, for example,
Hmm.
in their phase 2 studies. And so they reached out to me to see if I would like to collaborate around increasing representation, which I was happy to do. And I was part of that effort when they had their initial multi-site study to do the phase 3 studies for MDMA for PTSD. Well, they had a lead-in phase 2 study where they, sort of ironed out the wrinkles before jumping into the randomized part. And I was
Hmm.
part of that. At that point, I was at the University of Connecticut, and our site was specializing in recruiting participants of color. And so, up to leading up to that point, one of the things we had identified is exactly as you pointed out, there weren't really therapists of color who were part of these sites, who were on these teams in very, very small numbers. And so we know that this is going to be one barrier to recruiting people of color, because they're not going to see themselves represented. And then also, when you have very homogenous teams, they don't understand how to do outreach to people in other racial, ethnic, and cultural groups. And so you need
Yeah.
that diversity on your team in order to be
Hmm.
effective, and even just knowing how to approach those groups, much less providing culturally, informed treatment for them. So, so this was really one of the things we were really wanted to focus on, was just bringing in people of color at our site in Connecticut. And we actually did that very well. But unfortunately, we ran into a lot of pushback from the university that we did not expect. And we weren't able to continue moving forward with that. So our site had to close down. And it was
Oh,
actually traumatic for, I would say, our participants and us as researchers, because we had spent, over a year
I'm sure. Yeah.
training and preparing and making a site ready and recruiting and bringing people in. We had to unenroll them, and and there were a lot of tears for sure. But one of the things I had hoped was that all of the work that we had put into making changes to the protocols and the informed consent and education and training of the therapists, of the independent raters, that would carry it forward. So even without our participation, the hope was that the study would continue to be diverse. We
Mm.
even did a grant funded training for therapists of color. We trained 50 therapists of color in the
Wow.
MAPS protocol.
Wow.
Yeah, it was fantastic. And so I'm like, okay, you guys, you have the roadmap. You have your therapist of color now. I wrote a paper about how to do culturally informed recruitment of people of color. So I'm like, okay, I wrote the paper. Now go do it. But
Yeah,
I
it's like,
think, right. But unfortunately, it didn't happen that way. And I think maybe without me there to kind of keep pushing on it, there wasn't really a lot of follow through. So as you saw in that first study that came out, the diversity just wasn't there, and
hmm.
which was really unfortunate, because at that point they knew how to do it, and I think they realized that too, and they're like, what, we can do better. And I know that they brought on other people of color. I know some of my good friends and colleagues, they really like pushed from their sites, and
Hmm.
said, look, we're going to prioritize this. We're going to bring in, and we're going to intentionally recruit and bring in people of color. So then you saw an increase, when that second study came out. But
Yeah.
still, it's still true, though. It still was not really enough to make a case that, yes, this is going to be generalizable.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. I was thinking about when you were saying you had to cut down the study like halfway through, and that, as you're saying, like must have been so traumatic because you're working with vulnerable populations, and especially people of color and racial trauma. It sounds horrible, and I'm so sorry that that happened. I do want to ask you, like, how did you get the 50 participants? Like, what was your approach? Like, how did you make your clinic friendly to people of color that they felt safe to come there?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, because I mean, it just so happens that MAPS already has had at that point, I don't know if they
Mm.
still do, but they had a very long list of therapists who wanted to get training, many, many more than they had spots for. So we were actually able to go through the list that they had and pull out the therapists of color and invite them to the
Oh.
special training that we were doing. And we also, though, it was very important to us as well. We did this in Louisville, Kentucky. It was
Hmm.
very important that we also bring in local therapists. And that was part of the reason we had it in Kentucky in the first place, because most of these trainings had been on the West Coast or East Coast, and very little had been in that area. Very few trainings had been in places where, where we could really count on bringing in communities of color. And
Hmm.
I knew the community, and my co-director Sarah Reed, she knew the community, and we're like, we're going to bring in people from the community. But that didn't happen. They didn't come.
Oh
And
no.
I know we were so disappointed. I mean, it was still successful because we had so many people from everywhere else, but we're like, huh, why didn't
Yeah,
we get people right here in Kentucky? And
yeah,
as it turned out, we didn't know, but there had been a community trauma actually that lasted for decades. And there was a center, a prison and drug treatment center called the Addiction Research Center, or the ARC, in Lexington. And they had been exploiting Black inmates for decades
yes,
and doing unethical research on them. So there was this community memory of
yeah.
this. People would say, oh, well, I had an uncle and he took a psychedelic and his
Hmm.
brain got fried, thinking about the abusive research that happened there. And so that really kind of just tainted it for us. And folks didn't want to come. And actually, now we're trying to really understand what the impact is on that community even today, because clearly there's some kind of cultural memory there. And we're hoping actually to get people from Lexington who will come and talk to us about what they might
Mm.
know or have heard or seen about what happened, at
Hmm.
that institute and how it affected people in the community.
Yeah, it's like what you're talking about is beyond stigma. It's trauma related with psychedelics. It's not just like, oh, psychedelics are bad for you. It's that they
Exactly.
caused the trauma. That was the source. So, I mean, that was one of the way that it was people were exploited. And so yeah, how do somebody come around that? But I'm so glad that like recent media, of course, like whenever I go on LinkedIn, I see your posts about psychedelics, and then like Oprah recently spoke with Michael Pollan, and then Trevor Noah has been speaking about psychedelics. So when I see Black people speak about psychedelics, and and at the same time, other Black people who are talking to them will be like, "Oh my God, no, we are not doing this." And then these people are like, "No, we found healing," and yeah, it's what you're describing is, as I said, like beyond stigma. It's just traumatic.
Yeah, yeah, there's a real memory of this in many
Yeah.
ways too, as well as the war on drugs. But yeah, in terms of Black people and celebrities, I a few years ago I had the opportunity to be on Red Table Talk with
Oh,
Jada Pinkett Smith and
yeah.
family,
Yeah.
and she was really interested in it, and Jaden was all into it, but their mom
Right.
was like, I don't
Mm.
think so. I don't know if I'm down for it, even though several of them had tried psychedelics, and I believe Will Smith talks about having done
Yeah,
ayahuasca
yeah.
several times to try to help his marriage. I don't know if it worked, but in any case, but there was still that you can still see that generational no.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, I try to explain it to my mom, the type of research I'm interested in, or my
Yeah,
mother-in-law, and they're both like, "Hmm." Like they're like, good that you're doing research, but at the same time, they're like, okay.
like, yeah, you
Um,
go.
you go. Yeah, exactly. Um,
Hey, we hope you're enjoying the podcast so far. Now, if you want to support and become part of the psychedelic movement, feel free to donate to MAPS Canada at the link in the description below. Thank you for helping our mission to support equitable access to legal and regulated psychedelic medicines for all Canadians.
I want to move our conversation towards research now, and I know that you've done this MDMA and ketamine-assisted therapy to help individual process race-based traumatic stress. So I want to ask you, what is racial trauma or traumatic stress? And again, I think you have pointed out so many times in your videos where racism doesn't look like the old racism where people are flying Confederate flags, which actually there are some in Abbotsford, where I used to live, but it's not so overt, and it's more like, covert. So I wanted to ask you, like, what is racial trauma or traumatic stress, and um, how should we deal with that?
Right. Well, the easiest way to think about racial trauma is basically when you've had experienced so much racism that you have the symptoms of PTSD.
Mm,
And and it's not necessarily, we don't necessarily call it PTSD, although sometimes often it does meet the criteria for PTSD. But usually when we think about PTSD, we tend to be thinking of maybe like a specific incident that's traumatized a person, like a sexual assault
Hmm.
or an accident or combat. And with racism, it's usually a long accumulation of events, as well as maybe even historical traumas and cultural traumas and community traumas on top of it. So we are learning more now about PTSD, and that most people who have PTSD actually don't get PTSD from just one trauma. It's usually several traumas before they
Hmm.
actually break down and get PTSD.
Yes.
And it's the exact same with racism, but in addition to things that happen to you directly, it also encompasses things that have happened to your community and your family and your whole people group.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I myself came to Canada 5 years ago, and I visited other countries where it's white dominated, and I can say that I feel like much more safer in Canada. But it's still like I see racism all around me. It's everywhere. It's in the classrooms that I'm attending. It's in the office rooms that I'm sitting in. It's with my colleagues, and it's like I can never point it out. It's just there, and I'm like, did you just say that? And then I don't know how to bring it up, and it's like I'm anxious and I'm thinking about it, and yeah, it's very stressful. You have to be like it puts you in a state of flight or fight all the time.
It's so true. And, and for people like me, I mean, I was, born and raised in the United States. I'm in Canada now. It's not really so different, even though people say it is. But but I'm used to dealing with racism. I mean, I'm
Mm,
used to it being around me, and I can only imagine what it's like for someone, like yourself, maybe coming from another country where certainly there were other kinds of stigma and discrimination, but the racism being very different and seeing it everywhere and having people be like, "Oh, I don't see that. What are you talking about?" I mean, I can't imagine how crazy making that must be
it
when you're
is.
seeing it everywhere, and it's almost like, "Well, why aren't you seeing it?"
Yeah, you're right. And how are we supposed to help, like get help from psychedelics? Like, how are we supposed to help ourselves deal with such a heavy burden of living in this in this world where people all around us sort of look down upon you just because the skin color is different?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't know if there's an easy answer, um, but I do know that psychedelics can be helpful for people of color dealing with racism. And we have research that shows that it can, and that many people of color are using psychedelics to heal from racial trauma. We did a
Hmm.
study a few years ago where we did a national survey in the United States and in Canada, to ask people of color if they were using psychedelics to help with their racial trauma. And we were worried at first, like, well, what if we don't get anybody, and what if nobody's doing that, or they are and nobody wants to talk about it. And we were so surprised at the response that we got, and it was
Good.
like, oh wow, this is a real thing. They're doing
Mhm.
it. It's helping them for the most part. And yeah, and people are suffering from racial trauma, and they are turning to psychedelics as one avenue for healing, strength, you know getting through it.
Yeah, getting through it. And MDA especially helps so much with PTSD. And I know that you have been doing psychedelics research as well. And do you think there's like psilocybin versus MDMA versus ayahuasca? Like, do you think there is one thing that works the best? Because I feel like because MDMA impacts oxytocin so much, I feel like that really helps opening up and talking about trauma. But I wanted to find out your views on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think we have a lot of reasons to believe that MDMA is especially good for PTSD.
Mhm.
And if I had a choice right now, that's what I would be using in my clinics. Right now, the only psychedelic that we can legally use is ketamine. And so we have
Mhm.
been using that for treatment of depression and of PTSD. And I have to be honest, it's been very effective. I can't
Okay.
really tell you that, oh, MDMA would be so much better, because we have very good results with the ketamine. So, um, so as I said, if I had the MDMA, I would certainly use that, but
I
we
understand.
don't have the research that says one is better than the other. So we don't have head-to-head studies where we've looked at ayahuasca versus ketamine, or ketamine versus MDMA, or MDMA versus
Mm,
psilocybin for any specific disorder. And I think that's coming. But right now, I think there's such an emphasis on just doing the basic research we need to get it legalized and approved, that
yes,
those studies are going to have to come later.
I understand. Um, how do we reconcile the history of psychedelics being criminalized in ways that disproportionately harm communities of color, as we just spoke about, with the current medicalization, which is largely led by white institutions?
Yeah, I mean, this is a good question too, because, well, I mean, it's already a problem that Western medicine is very Eurocentric in its orientation.
Hmm.
Its approach to healing has been optimized to work well for white people, right?
Yes, yeah.
And a lot of these approaches may or may not be good for people of color, may or may not be appropriate for people in different cultural groups. And so that's already a problem. And then we're bringing in psychedelics, which actually have a long, rich history of being helpful in many indigenous communities all over the world for hundreds of thousands of years. And unfortunately, a lot of that knowledge is lost due to, colonization and, suppression of indigenous practices. Many of those practices had to go underground, or they were just completely wiped out. So much indigenous knowledge is lost, but there's a lot there that can be really useful. And in fact, so much of what we know actually has been appropriated from indigenous practice, um,
Hmm.
and made to employed in the service of Western medicine. And so we've jury is still out on how that is gonna go long term, but I do think that if people of color knew their history, they, it would be a big game changer in terms of acceptance and use of psychedelics in those communities. And I think we need to make space for each community to rediscover psychedelics on their own and use them in a way that's appropriate for their communities.
Yes, your answer resonates with me so much because this was why, again, like my way of explaining to my parents that, this is like we have used it, like our ancestors have called it soma, and
Mhm.
weed is amrit. Like, I just like try and explain that it used to be our medicine. And like it's written in the Vedas that Amrita used to bring joy after like to reduce rumination, you should drink the Amrit or something like that. And so when I explain that, they're like, yeah, but it's not happening anymore and it's all drugs. But as you're saying, like it's ancestral and it's not like it's stolen medicine. Like how was it Gordon Wasson who got the name for psilocybin, but it was actually Santa Maria who was
Right?
the one
Exactly.
curandera. Yeah, she was the one doing it. So yeah, I just wish people like learned, as you're saying, more about that this is our culture and this is where it comes from. I feel like this will help them believe it. Um, and that'll make the medicine work better.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, psychedelics I mean, they're on every continent, in the
Yes,
world. They grow
yes.
out of the ground, natural. So, I know some people feel like, oh, there's something, evil about psychedelics, or
Hmm.
I don't know. And the way I see it is, if God is making medicine that grows out of the ground that helps your mental health problems, then that's probably what that's for. know?
I
Um,
love that. I'm gonna use it. Um, what structural changes would you like to see in psychedelic research, training, or therapy programs for BIPOC people and like practitioners and participants both?
oh, that's a good question. And I think one of the big problems that I see is so much of the training and the research is very much biomedical oriented, which I think is
Mm,
super important. I mean, I think it's very critical that we understand the molecules and the brain processes, and how all that works. But there's so much more to it, and we can't just reduce it to, brain mechanisms. We know that there are, there's a relational piece, there's a therapeutic piece, there's the importance of the container, and there's a spiritual piece too. That, I mean, I have to be honest, this spiritual piece, this was never part of my training as a psychologist and a researcher. And I remember coming to my first, psychedelic conferences and hearing people talk about mystical experiences. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what are they talking about? This is so uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But you can't do this work and not have all that stuff come up. And I mean, our very first participant that we had in our MAP study in Connecticut, he was talking to Krishna, during his experience, and also made a rap song. And and you have to, as a clinician, you have to be able to make room for that for your clients or participants.
Wow.
That's part of people's experience in their lives, and they're tapping into spiritual things that we don't even really understand yet how that works. Maybe we never will, and from a biomedical perspective, but it's happening.
Yeah, it's so true. And I would like to share one of my journeys I had, where my dad was Christian and my mom is Hindu, and they married. So I was raised fully Christian, and I don't like practice Christianity or anything. But in one of my journeys, Shivji or Shiva showed up. And then I had another therapeutic journey, and then Shiva came up again. And then I found this little shivling on the beach in Canada, out of nowhere. And I was just like, I'm trying really hard to keep my brain in like a very neuroscience, like understanding everything in a scientific perspective and not go into this, but what is happening? So when you say the Krishna thing, I'm like, yeah, I saw a God which I never prayed to.
Right.
So
yeah, because it's part of your heritage.
yeah, exactly. It's super interesting.
Yeah,
And
it really is. And this is one of the things we're doing actually at the University of Ottawa is, we're developing training programs. We have 2 micro programs in psychedelics, one in psychedelics and spirituality and one in psychedelic science. And we just launched a master's program. And our goal was to not, duplicate the training programs that are out there that are very biomedical focused, but to really have a very interdisciplinary, holistic approach to psychedelics that includes medicine, psychology, neuroscience, religion, anthropology, all of these different pieces, which I think all have a place. And that's what I think's been missing. And that's one of the things that I'm most proud of this training program. Because believe me, it wasn't really like on my radar, like, oh, I'm going to start a new master's program because I have nothing better to do. I would have been quite happy to let other people do that. But nobody was really approaching it in a way that, well, I'll just be honest with you. I talk to people all over who are in many different psychedelic training programs. And I always ask people of color, what's it like for you in that program? And usually they're like, oh, yeah, it's good. It's good. And I'm like, okay, now tell me really. And then they would tell me like how racist these programs are. And I was like, oh no. Yes. And then people ask me, where can I go and get training? And I don't feel good sitting in some place where I know that it's racist. So I was like, I got to start my own program.
Oh my God. Wow.
I'm David Bronner, Cosmic Engagement Officer. Dr. Bronner's board member of MAPS. Subscribe to MAPS Canada. Bam.